Mary Tudor was born on the 18th of February 1516, a long-awaited miracle in a kingdom obsessed with heirs. Bells rang across England when the daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon survived infancy, for at last the Tudor dynasty had a living child, healthy, intelligent, unmistakably royal. From her earliest days, Mary was treated not as a consolation prize, but as a dynastic asset. She was titled Princess of Wales, presided over her own household, and educated as though she might one day rule, not because England believed in queens, but because England feared extinction. Her mother, Catherine of Aragon, raised her with profound piety and unshakable dignity. From her father, Mary inherited intelligence, stubbornness, and an absolute sense of legitimacy. She was taught that she was lawful. She was taught that she was loved. Both lessons would later be ripped from her by force. When Mary was 17, her world collapsed. Henry VIII, desperate for a male heir and consumed by his desire for Anne Boleyn, rejected Catherine of Aragon and declared their marriage invalid. In a single act of royal will, Mary was transformed from legitimate princess into bastard, stripped of her title, rank, and identity. She was forced to serve in the household of her infant half-sister, Elizabeth, the living symbol of her mother's humiliation. Worse still, she was ordered to acknowledge that her parents' marriage had been unlawful, and that she herself had never been legitimate at all. Mary refused, and for that refusal, she was punished relentlessly. Mary was separated from her mother and forbidden from seeing her again. Catherine of Aragon died without ever being allowed to embrace her daughter one final time. Mary's health deteriorated. She suffered chronic illness, depression, and what modern historians recognize as severe psychological trauma. She lived under constant surveillance, her correspondence monitored, her loyalty questioned. To obey was to deny her mother. To resist was to risk death. Eventually, broken by pressure and fearing execution, Mary signed a document acknowledging her illegitimacy, but she never believed it. She carried the truth like a wound that never healed. Anne Boleyn fell. Jane Seymour rose. Sons were born and died. Wives were married and executed. Mary learned a brutal lesson early. Survival required silence. Under her father's reign, she learned to bend without breaking, to submit outwardly while preserving faith inwardly. She attended Protestant services she despised. She swallowed insults she never forgave. Henry restored her to the line of succession, but never her legitimacy. She would always be provisional, always conditional. When Henry VIII died in 1547, the crown passed to Edward VI, Mary's half-brother, a devout Protestant raised to believe Catholicism was a disease. Under Edward's reign, England underwent rapid religious transformation. The Mass was abolished, images destroyed, Latin prayers erased. Mary refused to comply. She continued to hear Mass in private, protected only by her royal blood and the threat of foreign intervention from her cousin, Emperor Charles V. But she knew her position was precarious, and when Edward sickened, the kingdom moved swiftly to exclude her once more. Edward VI named Lady Jane Grey his heir, bypassing both Mary and Elizabeth. Jane was crowned. Mary was declared a traitor, and once again, Mary faced a choice she knew too well: submission or annihilation. This time she chose defiance. Mary rode east, gathering supporters as she went. Farmers, nobles, and townsmen rallied not to ideology, but to legitimacy. She was Henry VIII's daughter. She was the rightful queen, and England, weary of manipulation, rose for her. Jane Grey's reign collapsed in 9 days. Mary entered London in triumph, crowned Queen of England in 1553, the first woman to rule in her own right. She was 37 years old. She had survived everything meant to destroy her. Mary did not see her accession as victory. She saw it as divine justice. Her reign would be an act of restoration, not of personal power, but of religious truth. England, she believed, had strayed from God. It was her sacred duty to bring it back, no matter the cost. She reunited England with Rome. She restored Catholic worship. She truly believed that souls were at stake. Mary married Philip of Spain, a union meant to secure Catholic succession and international strength. But England feared him, feared foreign rule, feared loss of sovereignty, feared Mary herself becoming irrelevant. The marriage was childless. Mary suffered false pregnancies, each hope followed by crushing disappointment. Her body betrayed her. Her dynasty slipped away. The Marian persecutions began not as cruelty, but as conviction. Heresy, in Mary's eyes, was not dissent, it was damnation. Nearly 300 Protestants were burned at the stake, their deaths searing Mary's reputation into history as Bloody Mary. But Mary did not watch these executions with pleasure. She prayed for the souls she condemned. She believed she was saving them. That belief is what makes her terrifying and tragic. By 1558, Mary was ill, grieving, and isolated. Her husband was absent, her policies deeply unpopular, her dream of a Catholic heir unrealized. She named Elizabeth her successor, not because she trusted her, but because England demanded continuity. Mary died on the 17th of November 1558, believing she had failed God. History did not forgive Mary. It reduced her to fire and fanaticism. It forgot her childhood, forgot her losses, forgot the girl who watched her world collapse and decided certainty was safer than mercy. Mary, I was not a monster. She was a woman forged by humiliation, abandoned by her father, stripped of identity, and taught that faith was the only thing that could not be taken from her. She ruled as she believed she must, and she paid for it with her name. Elizabeth learned to compromise. Mary never could, and in that refusal lies both her greatness and her ruin.